Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is MC Brown. I'm VP of Products here at Continuent, and today I'm going to be telling you about our new releases, Tungsten Clustering 6.0 and Tungsten Replicator 6.0. Before we get started and dig into the webinar and the details, a few points of order. This session is being recorded. If you want to come back and watch this session another time, you can come back, have a look at our website. It'll be available on our website, our YouTube channel, and elsewhere. Also, if you have any questions, you want to ask any questions as we go through this, there is a little question panel on the right-hand side. I can't guarantee that I will always be able to answer all of the questions due to the time we have available. But if you ask the questions and I'm not able to answer them while we're on this call right now, what I will do instead is I will collect all of those questions together and we'll make a blog post about it. And you'll be able to follow out that information by having a look at our blog at continuent.com. So with those two little bits of administration out the way, I guess we probably ought to get started and dig into having a look at these new releases. So what we're going to have a look at in this webinar, I'm going to have a look at Tungsten Clustering 6.0. So this is our brand new release. This is something that we've been working on for about the last 15 months. And, there's a number of key areas of functionality in here. If you're an existing customer or you're a new customer, you're coming in, you want to have a look at what we've got available. I'm hopefully going to describe to you exactly what is featured in these new releases and what functionality we have. We're going to have a look at Tungsten Replicator 6.0. There are fewer new functionality in the 6.0 because we've made a lot of improvements to the replicator in some of our point releases in the 5.x series over the last year. But obviously, I'm happy to show you what else we've got. We do have some new stuff, always worth looking at seeing what we've got. And then I'm also going to just give a quick overview of kind of what's happening next. What are we doing at Continuent as we move forward? And I'll give you a little overview at the end of obviously what's coming up in the shorter term and over the next year. So let's start by just digging into Tungsten Clustering. So Tungsten Clustering 6.0 is our primary product of the company. This is what the majority of our customers use. And the main focus of this product is a MySQL clustering solution. Hides your MySQL cluster, a properly managed high availability cluster behind a set of connectors your application will never know. And then obviously provides a combination of high availability, disaster recovery, read-write splitting, handles your entire process, manages it. Our key element of that a number of our products actually use is we go one stage further. That's obviously just a standalone cluster. What we've done is we've expanded that. We have always had a solution which is called our Multi-Site Multimaster. And what we've done is we've expanded on that original solution. So that original Multi-Site Multimaster solution is a great solution for getting your systems to work. And it works on the basis of one cluster in one region, one cluster in another region. And not only do you have all of the clustering functionality of those individual regions, and obviously you have master capability, so you can write at both clusters. We can also replicate between those clusters. So if you've got, say, something in Japan and something in Europe, and you want to be able to handle that, you can have those local clusters to give you the maximum performance, all of the benefits of HA and DR, and then because we replicate between them, you also get all of the functionality that you would expect. You get a shared data set, you get the ability to obviously redirect queries between the two. We have improved on that core functionality, and we're going to dig into that in a little minute. I'll show you exactly what I mean by that enhanced functionality. Now, this actually represents more than a year's worth of work, and the reason why it involved a year's worth of work and a year's worth of development and improvements is because we've actually added a massive amount of new functionality into the system in order to make it a much more unified and coherent solution for this type of multi-master deployment. We've also made a number of other, small little changes. We've obviously improved the user interface a little bit in order to take account of these changes. We've also done some simpler stuff. So we have actually now officially changed the name of the product to Tungsten Clustering, and the name of the package extension that you download will now be called Tungsten Clustering. Seems like a minor point, but it's one of those things that I think is mentally is a big change for us to go forward. But the main thing is this new multi-master. So in order to understand what is different about our new multi-master, we really need to have a look at what our old multi-master looked like. And this is an important distinction, right? We have decided to call our new solution multi-master, all one word, no hyphenation. This is to distinguish it from the old solution that we used to have, which we used to call multi-site multi-master. Right, and the reason for this, and it's a very, very deliberate reason, the reason for this is because in our old solution, what we would have is you would have these two clusters, right? Two individual clusters. And I'm going to use an example here. I'm going to use East and West, and that's because I'm actually going to show you a screenshot later that actually shows how this works. So let's say you have East. So let's say it's in New York, for example. And, this is our local standard clustering solution that we've always had available, Continuent Tungsten as was, Tungsten Clustering as it has been since the 5.0 release. This is our standard clustering solution. So you have MySQL, you have one master, as many slaves as you want, two or more slaves, normal slaves that you want. And then obviously you have our standard layout with the manager sitting and managing the entire process and the connector in front of that overall connection. Redistributing queries as they come in. And the manager's role there is obviously the manager is there to provide things like automatic failover. So if you have some kind of a problem within your cluster, we will automatically fail over to a different node. If there's a failure of a slave, we will obviously take that slave out of the process. And overall, the manager is there in order to manage that cluster and make sure that you have that high availability. And everything here is automated. People, customers who already have our solution, they're already going to know how this works. Most of the time, this thing is going to, if there's a failure of some kind, it's going to fail over within that cluster, and you're going to be notified about it, but also your applications are going to be unaware of it, because what will happen is the manager will take that MySQL slave out of the process, or it will take that master out of the process. It will switch over the masters. It will redirect the queries through the Tungsten connector in order to give you your new cluster. So that's our single cluster. This is in East. This is in New York. What we then had is we then had the ability, let's say you have another one, and this one we're going to call West. So West is in San Francisco. So San Francisco has exactly the same thing. You have another cluster. It has all of the same functionality, all of the HA, the DR, etc. Everything's set up. Now those two clusters are obviously at this point we're gonna take that those two clusters are independent. But what we always used to have is we used to have this notion of the multi-site to multi-master scenario. And the way that this operated is the two clusters at the site, so New York and San Francisco, East and West. In addition to the clustering software, we would then also install a separate Tungsten Replicator instance. And the Tungsten Replicator instance would be replicating data from East to West, and then would also replicate data from West to East. Then obviously it's the replicator. The replicator is slightly intelligent, so we would obviously make sure that you didn't loop, insert data into East and it goes to West and comes back and it goes round. We handle all of that for you. But most importantly, because we're replicating the data from East to West and West to East, and it's operating in a multi-master functionality, what you get is you get two independent clusters, and those two independent clusters are managing the entire process for you, right? So in East New York, you have all of your fast access, all of your customers and all of your clients who are using that cluster within New York obviously have access to all of that data, and they have access to that data very, very quickly because they've got that information, they've got it available. The same is true in West, right? They've got fast access to all of this information and all of this software, and they're able to organize and manage this effectively. But you've also got cross-site replication. So that means that everybody in New York has access to all of the same data that they have in San Francisco, and vice versa. Or more importantly, they can also edit it, right? So should there ever be a situation where, a customer from San Francisco or a client application from San Francisco needs to access the information and San Francisco is unavailable, you can access the data as it is in New York. And vice versa, right? So this is why we called it multi-site, multi-master. And these clusters are not limited to two of these clusters within this scenario. We have customers who have 3 and 4 and even a 5 cluster system, right, where they are distributing data around the world. So you get all of the benefit of your local, fast, quick access to your cluster and your information, while also then being able to share that data across multiple sites so that you get the best overall performance, you get the best overall experience across all of these different systems and operations. Now, the benefit of this multi-site multi-master is obviously you get all of the functionality you would expect. You get the HA, the DR between the cluster. You also get the distribution of information across all of your different clusters in all of your zones. You get the absolute highest performance. Now, that's not to say that there were not issues with the way that this obviously operated and issues with the way in which this functionality was provided and passed on. And that is, this process was, let's go back to our two cluster example. Let's just remind ourselves, right? Two separate individual clusters. Each cluster has HA, DR, zero downtime maintenance, all of the things that we are familiar with our standard clustering software. But then we are also replicating between them. So all of that functionality, but then with this shared data. It did mean that at the end of the day, what you ended up with is really you had two individual clusters, a separate replicator for that cross-site replication, and the two were seen as very, very separate. When it came to actual management of the system, right, that also presented its own individual problem from the perspective that not only did you have to manage the individual clustering software and ensure that that was working correctly, you also had to manage the cross-site replication, which was seen as completely separate. And that meant that all sorts of different operations that may have been simple from a perspective of a single cluster in a multi-site, multi-master were made a bit more complicated by the fact that you had to separately manage this cross-site replication between the two. It also meant that certain things were maybe not as smooth as they could have been. There was never a unified view of the overall cluster, right? You never got to the point where you had a nice view that said, this is the cluster status, and now I get the cluster status for every cluster within the overall multi-site, multi-master solution. And I wasn't able, for example, so our main tool for going in and monitoring it is CCTRL. You couldn't go into CCTRL and then have a look at the current status of the cluster. You could go into CCTRL and have a look at the status of East, or you could have a look at the status of West. You couldn't actually have a look at the status of the cluster, and you couldn't have a look at the overall status, including the cross-site replication. This meant that it was very, very difficult in order to understand how the cluster was operating, how the cluster was functioning. It also made it very, very difficult from the perspective of redirecting queries and managing the Tungsten connector and how data was obviously managed and redirected through that process, because there was not this unified view of the cluster and this unified view of management. It also meant the installation and then obviously everything that goes along with that, upgrades, etc. That was also made very, very complicated as well, because at the end of the day, you have now two separate products to manage. You have the individual cluster software to manage, and then you have the cross-site replicator to manage. And it also meant that when it came round to performing different types of operation, there were things that you now had to do in mind of all of these different steps, right? So there was a separate tool, for example, for having a look at replication overall. So you had multi-TREP CTL, and then you also had things like you had two completely separate sets of tools. So in order to have a look at, say, the replicator on one, you would have to use TREP CTL on one and TREP CTL for the other. It became very, very confusing, made it very, very difficult to manage. Other things like obviously performing schema changes through the system then also became more difficult, because if you were doing an online schema change, you had to manage the overall process. You couldn't do things like automatically shun and automatically redirect queries across different places. That option just wasn't available because these were seen as two separate individual products. So what have we done? So the reason why it's taken us a year of development is because we kind of rebuilt the structure that we understand as the overall cluster. And we've created what we call a composite multi-master. We actually dropped the composite for most of the time because it's now just simply a multi-master cluster, but we call it a composite multi-master when it comes to the overall configuration and deployment from a technical perspective. And the reason why we call it that is because we now have a single unified view of a cluster. So it doesn't matter whether you have 1, 2, 3, 5 different separate individual clusters in different sites. If they are part of this overall composite multi-master structure, you now have a unified view of the cluster. And that in itself creates a number of important things. One is we do now have a unified cluster view. We are actually going to go in and have a look at that and see what that looks like and see what that means in just a second. But you do now have a unified cluster view. You actually have an idea that you have a cluster which is made up of lots of individual clusters in different locations. Hence the term Composite Multimaster. Right? You still have exactly the same features and functionality. You still have the fact that in East you have a full master-slave scenario, so you have all of the benefits of performance. You have all of the benefits of being able to shun individual nodes, being able to fail over, being able to handle that kind of solution, being able to do your zero downtime maintenance, etc. All of that functionality still exists. And all of that functionality still exists at the West. The difference is that you now have a unified overall view of the entire cluster that gives you an idea of exactly what is going on all of the time. Now, the way that we've actually achieved that is we have moved some of the code that originally would have been separate. So remember I described we had individual tungsten clusters, and then we had individual tungsten replicators that would replicate the data between the two. What we have done is we have moved those replicators into the overall clustering structure. Now, obviously, there's already a replicator built into our clustering solution. That's how we replicate the data between the MySQL servers. What we've done is we've taken that information and we've taken that overall structure, and now those replicators not only replicate data within the cluster, they now also replicate data between the clusters. So now we have this structured, formatted way where we have two replication services within each replicator within the overall cluster deployment. And that means that you have a unified view from a replicator perspective. We know that the internal replication, so that is within West, is operating, and then we also have a separate replication stream which is handled by the second service on all of the replicators, and that manages the East from West, right? So then now we have a situation where we know from a replicator perspective that we have a unified view of what is going on without us having to use a different set of tools, without us having to go through and use this different set of command lines and different environments. Now, on top of that unification of the replication stream and the replication information, what we've also done is we've also then extended our management layer. So the Tungsten Manager, which handles the overall management of the individual cluster, ordinarily, obviously, we would go in and we would manage that individual process within the manager and within the CCTRL tool in order to operate. We actually haven't changed that in any way, but what we've done is we've moved those external replicators and also the management of those external replicators, and then also what that means from an overall cluster perspective, from a composite cluster perspective. And we've moved it all together so that it's all available within one single manager instance. So now, instead of you having to manage your entire process and perform all sorts of things like recovery procedures, etc., as you would have had to have done in our previous multi-site multi-master in 5x and lower, you've now got a unified view within CCTRL. You've now got a single view of the overall cluster, and everything is in one place. I can now view the overall status of the cluster, and I can now view the overall status of the replication, both within the individual clusters and across the composite cluster. I can also more effectively handle failure and failover between the two clusters. So that means that when something happens, for example, let's say, for example, you've got applications talking to the East cluster, and let's say for whatever reason your MySQL servers go down or the host handling your MySQL servers go down, and you want to be able to redirect those queries from East so that instead they're using the West cluster for operation. You're now able to do that within CTRL, and you're able to do it automatically. The connector will handle the functionality, and the connector will redirect the queries over to the remote, in inverted commas, cluster. And that means that you now have this unified and automated management. We don't do a few things within that, right? I should point out that while you can manually fail over between clusters of that size, we don't do automatic failover between those clusters, and we don't do that from a safety perspective, because obviously on a cross-site replication, on an overview like that, it's actually possible for there to be a transient error that may not cause the entire cluster to go down, and we don't want things to suddenly switch over without there being a purpose for it. But it does mean that should something happen, and obviously you could script this and control this from the outside, you have the ability now to fail over literally from your east cluster to your west cluster in case there's a problem. Overall, though, the real key thing here is that you now have a system where we have a composite view of the overall cluster. However many clusters you have in your Composite Multimaster solution, you now have one single view of the whole system, and so you can now get a good idea of what's going on and what's going on in the entire system, right? So let's review this. Backtrack just a little bit. Old style multi-site, multi-master clusters, what we would have is we would have individual clusters at each site, and then within each site we would then have a separate manageable component, which was the replicator that would replicate between them. And that would obviously replicate data from east to west and from west to east, and each of those needed to be managed separately. And not only did each of those need to be managed separately, by the way, but there would actually be an individual separate replicator on each of the hosts in each of the clusters, right? So you would now have a cluster which had its own Tungsten Manager, Tungsten Connector, and Tungsten Replicator, all managed by a single solution in CCTRL, and then a separate replicator on each host within your cluster that was doing the cross-site replication. We have eliminated that, and instead we've now embedded it all into. So we now have an embedded cross-site replication. So that means that each of those individual nodes within each of your two clusters are now fully aware of the fact that not only are they replicating data within their own local cluster, they're also fully aware of the fact that they are replicating data from their remote cluster. The manager is now also aware of that relationship, so it's aware of the fact that there is this individual replication within a single cluster, and they're also the manager is also aware of obviously this cross-site replication, so it's aware that there are two separate streams of replication that need to be managed for each of the nodes within the system, and it also therefore understands what happens, right? If one of your nodes goes down, it understands that it's more about just going, oh, hang on a second, I need to stop local replication and I need to shun this node from the local replication. Also now it understands it needs to shun that node from a cross-site replication. What that also means is that manager is now able to give you a unified view of the cluster. On the next slide, I'll show you what that actually looks like in terms of within the interface. And in fact, next week we're going to have a deep dive. You're going to be able to dig right down, and my associate Chris Parker is going to give you a full demo of exactly what that new, composite multi-master clustering looks like. But it will all be available. You'll be able to see what's going on. But that unified view of the cluster is really, really critical, because not only does it enable you to have an overview of exactly what's going on in the cluster, it also means that the cluster is aware of what's going on, right? So now it knows that it's a composite and knows that there are multiple clusters. It can more effectively handle things like failover between clusters, and handle connector redirection between clusters, and be aware of it. So the connector has also been updated as well. So the connector now has more effective redirection and understanding of what happens within a composite multi-master. So it knows, for example, that it is now part of a composite multi-master. And so the affinity selection that you had available within the connector, it knows exactly what's going on, right? And what can happen there is the connector now knows that it can redirect queries between the two, between one site to another, because it understands them. So it knows now that, if east is unavailable, it can start redirecting queries to west. And it can handle that automatically, even if the manager are necessarily unavailable. You get that unified cluster status. You have the failure and recovery within the clusters, and you also have it between the individual sites. Most importantly of all, and I think this is one of the things that is fairly critical, we have done a huge amount of work in order to make sure that this brand new solution is really, really, really easy to install. And so now, instead of what you had before, which was install the clustering, then install the cross-site replicators, which caused all sorts of problems from the perspective of obviously performing the original installation and then performing the actual update that would actually change that and update it and configure and control that overall deployment. We now have a single installation. You have a single configuration file. At the moment, we only support any installations, but you can have a single configuration file, and that single configuration file describes the overall process and the overall configuration of the cluster. And one TPM install is going to install that entire thing onto your machines. Repeat that over however many nodes you have in your multi-site multi-master, much, much easier. And of course, this also means goes forward. Obviously, updates are easier. updates are very, very much easier, and you can do exactly the same as you could before. Shun an individual node within an individual cluster, perform an update, move on to the next one, shun an individual node, perform an update, or just perform an update, knowing that there's going to be that 1 second gap where we kick over the connectors to the new version and it's all updated. Very, very, very much simpler installation, very, very much simpler deployment, very, very, very much simpler overall operation of the cluster on updates. And this means less downtime, more uptime, certainly more stability in your cluster, and certainly, a much better overall experience. Now, that overall experience actually is really important because what I want to show you here is, so this is our new view. There's a bunch of different new views within CTRL in order to give you a new idea of exactly what is going on within a composite cluster. But this is probably one of the main ones. If you go, let's consider our demo rather. So we have East New York, we have West San Francisco. Those two together, those are individual clusters. Those two together go to make up a single composite cluster, and that single composite cluster could be called whatever you wanted it to be called. In this case, it's actually called USA, right? So we now have a composite cluster called USA, and USA contains the individual clusters of East and West. If you now go into CCTRL and say use USA and then do an LS in order to get the current status, what you get back is this screen that you see right now, right? And you can see here that we have our data sources listed. We have two separate data sources. We have East, that's our East cluster, and we have West, which is our West cluster. And you can see that it is listed here. It's listed here as a composite master. That is a composite master slave deployment. We can see that it's online. And we can also see that we have this brand new statement of our overall progress. And this is called the global progress. Now, this global progress is a combination of the local cluster status, so that is the sequence number in the East cluster, as well as the progress of the information that comes from the replication from East from West, right? So with one single view, we can go in and have a look, and you can say, oh, global progress. I can see that it's up to date because the number is a combination of local progress and progress of replication from my remote site to this host. So you can see now that you have a unified view of what is actually going on in your cluster. And more to the point, if we just dig down into the individual, you can see that there is an East, that's our overall cluster. You can see that the master is online, progress is 1. You can see the latency. These are running on VMs on my laptop, so latency of a second is not necessarily unusual. And then you also have East from West. So this is our cross-site replication. So this is our cross-site replication moving data from our West cluster into our East cluster. And you can see you have this overall display here that shows you exactly what that progress is. Shows you that it's a relay because we're relaying data from the remote cluster, and you can see that the replication is going through. You can see here, status is okay, everything is running, everything is up to date. Ditto, next cluster, you can see we've got West, then we've got West from East, which is the replication of data from the East cluster into the West cluster. And this is showing the overall progress for the cluster, right? This is not showing the progress for a single host. This is showing the overall progress for the cluster. So you can see how we have this cross-replication of all of the data between the clusters, and you can see we now have this unified view that tells you exactly what is going on. I don't need to go into CCTRL and do an LS and understand what my local cluster configuration is like, and then separately go out and have a look and see what the cross-site replication is organized like. I could go into CCTRL and I've got this single functionality here. All of the rest of the functionality along those lines has also been updated, right? So when I pull all of this information across and I go in and I have a look at this, I have a set of all of the same tools. I can go directly down straight into the East cluster. I can perform operation on data sources. I can back up clusters. I can back up data sources. I can recover clusters. I can recover data sources. I can recover a composite cluster through that process. So everything here is now a unified single view and a single overall view of the cluster and a single overall management interface into understanding what's going on. This particular example, obviously, there are only 2 individual clusters within the overall composite. We could have a lot more. We could have 3 or 4 or 5. We have actually tested those combinations all the way up. The same is true, by the way, if you have a what we call a composite DR. So that is where you have a local cluster and you have a remote cluster, and that remote cluster is there purely for the purposes of disaster recovery. So all of the data is being replicated from your single local cluster to that remote cluster for disaster recovery. The same functionality is true. So we're using the same composite overview as we have here, and you get that same unified view. So you can see that your remote, your DR cluster, is also up to date with your local cluster all of the time. Again, this is really, really key because it means a single unified view of your cluster and a single management interface makes the whole thing so much easier to update and deploy, so much easier to manage, and overall that should result in better uptimes, better experience, better functionality ultimately for you guys. So that's actually our key functionality. So that's Tungsten Clustering. That's actually what we spent the bulk of our last year working on. We have actually done a huge amount in the Replicator over the last year as well. So in the background, while the clustering has been going on, we've been adding new functionality into the Tungsten Replicator. I mean, over the last year, we've done things like, automatic DDL translation. We now support Cassandra and Kafka and Elasticsearch as targets. A huge number of improvements in terms of the individual tools. So we have better tools for understanding what's going on with TREP-CTL. We have better statistics information out of TREP-CTL. We have better statistics information out of the THL tool. All of that functionality, that was all stuff that was added in different releases in the 5X series that came out over the last year, over 2017, added a huge amount of functionality. So when it comes to new stuff that we put into 6.0 for Tungsten Replicator, I have to admit there is not a huge amount of new functionality here. What we have done is we have added back a few different bits and pieces of information. Some of this has been asked for by customers. Some of this has been stuff that we know people have been looking for and that we wanted to be able to support. So the first thing is that we now support writing into PostgreSQL again. So Postgres has always been a very, very popular solution. In fact, our Tungsten Clustering originally was designed to work with Postgres before we moved to MySQL. We have now added back the support. So you can replicate now out of Oracle or MySQL and replicate into Postgres if that's what you want to do. Now, this is a standard JDBC applier. So this means that everything that you can do with, our standard heterogeneous replication, you're actually able to do with this Postgres applier now. We can apply that data in. And obviously, it should also apply to any compatible environment. So a lot of different environments are Postgres compatible. One of the reasons why we were able to add this backing quite so relatively easily is obviously things like Redshift and Vertica are actually also largely Postgres compatible. So we were able to add that functionality back in fairly quickly. We don't yet do extraction out of Postgres, but it is something that we're looking into and we're looking into adding because obviously we know a lot of customers would be interested in that if we could do it. The next thing that we added actually is just an improvement on our Kafka applier. So we added the Kafka applier back in 5.2 around about June last year in 2017. And, the Kafka applier was really, really practical, but a couple of customers have started using it. And a couple of them are kind of looked at it and said, it would be really useful if we could get a kind of a bit more information about what's going on. In particular, what they wanted to be able to do is they wanted to be able to identify whether a message from a transaction that was replicated out over Kafka, whether that individual message, what transaction that was a part of, and whether there were other messages that were part of that overall transaction. So what we've done is we've actually added transactional information, first of all, into the THL and into the transactional. That's actually handled by a filter. So that means now for each transaction, you can get information about how many rows were updated on a per table basis within an individual transaction, right? So if you've done a transaction and you've updated the rows in 10 different tables across 300 different rows, that information is now tracked within the THL if you've enabled this filter. But more importantly, when it comes to a Kafka applier, is we now embed that information into each message, and we can also send either a separate message or additionally send another message out on a completely separate Kafka topic that gives information. This transaction number, so this sequence number within the THL involves this number of overall messages, and the messages are split, 10 for this table, 5 for this table, 3 for this table, etc. That information is broadcast out just as another JSON message out on a separate channel, as well as optionally being embedded into each individual message. Really, really key then, because it means if you're looking at your looking at your Kafka messages, you can go in and say, okay, there should be 300 messages a part of this transaction, and so therefore it's easier to reconstitute them. Two other smaller things that we've added. So an improvement to our cloud deployments. There was a tiny little bug in our replicator in that it only supported relatively small server IDs. And as we move into more cloud environments, sometimes those server IDs are quite large. So we've fixed that. We've also improved our functionality so that for those situations where you have say an application is writing to your Oracle or MySQL database and you can't actually change the database and configuration, but you know that there is effectively the same as a primary key, or you could constitute a primary key by bonding different fields together in order to generate a unique primary key of the information. You can now customize your primary keys without you having to modify the database, and that means that you can now replicate data out of databases into an analytic solution, whereas previously you would have been unable to do that because of that missing unique primary key. So I mentioned this earlier. That was our functionality that we've added to the replicator. Obviously, for both the clustering and the replicator, please feel free. We do have full release notes available. There's a blog post that contains a bit more detail. You want to go in and have a look. The other option, if you're particularly interested in the clustering, if you attend our webinar next week, so my associate Chris Parker will be doing a deep dive into the clustering in terms of what's available and what functionality, or what the new system looked like, what it is like to manage, what it is like to monitor and understand what's going on. Please go ahead and attend that if you want to get a better understanding of what that replication, that clustering rather, operates like and how that functions. And what that looks like. That will be your best opportunity to see what the new 6.0 clustering looks like. In terms of what we're doing generally as Continuent as a company, we are working on a number of new products. Some of these we have announced before. We do actually have a new GUI coming that we've been working on, so expect an announcement about that very shortly. We're also working on a tungsten backup solution, which will make use of our clustering and our replication expertise. And we'll give you the ability to do, logical and physical backups and restores back to both your original solution and obviously out to analytics if you want to do a particular dump. We're working on that. We're also working on a standalone version of the connector. So our connector is a very, very powerful proxying solution. We're going to be able to make that available and make the Tungsten connector available as a standalone component and a standalone configurable component. We're also working on a number of other things. You may have seen one of our announcements recently. We are moving more into cloud environments. We are trying to make our solutions available, compatible as we can with different cloud environments and ultimately easier to deploy. Obviously, lots of customers are already using us in a variety of different environments. We've got customers who are using us in Rackspace, VMware, and AWS. They're using us already. We're hoping to make that a little bit easier. And again, that's something that we're working on and we're trying to develop this year. So keep your eyes peeled if you are interested in what we're doing. If you would like any more information about all what's happened in today's webinar, please feel free to get in touch. You can see some contact details of places where you can get additional information on screen right now. Unfortunately, I am actually a little bit over time, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer any questions, but please feel free to keep those questions coming in. I will answer them on the blog. If you have any questions after this webinar, please feel free to get in touch. I'll leave my details up there. If you want to send me an email, or you want to send anybody else an email, please feel free to get in touch and ask questions. We will answer the questions as best we can. And, the questions from this webinar, like I said, will go up on a blog post after this webinar has gone out. So that's it. Hopefully you found this informative. Hopefully you're excited as we are about the new Tungsten clustering and what it will look like. And obviously how much better it is going to make your multi-site deployments of a MySQL clustering solution. Please get in touch if you want to have a look. Have a look at a POC, or maybe you're an existing customer, you want to have a demo. We are more than happy to help. Any other questions, please leave them. Please get in touch. Otherwise, that's it. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope you have a very good day, however much there is left of it, and we'll speak to you again next time.